Hey guys, what's up? Welcome to the first Q&A of 2021. As always, thank you so much for your questions, and also as always, if I don't answer your question in this Q&A, then you can go ahead and copy and paste it onto the bottom of this Patreon post, and I might answer it in the next one. And finally, please don't forget to like all the questions that you want answered, because I generally answer the questions in order of how many likes they have. So yeah, welcome to the new year. It's great to finally be out of 2020, and hopefully Refold will be able to do lots of cool things this year. So thank you guys so much for supporting. And also, back before we had the Refold Patreon and when I was on the Matt vs. Japan Patreon, I was filming these Q&As every other week, so twice a month. And I had been doing that for 2 years. So now on the new Refold Patreon, I'm only filming a Q&A once a month. And then every other week we're doing a Q&A instead. So now every other week there's this alternation between, every other week there's this alternation between Q&A, live stream, Q&A, live stream. And so basically, this is the first time I've gone an entire month without filming a Q&A since I very first started doing these Q&As in, I think, potentially late 2017, which is totally crazy. And so, yeah, this is actually the second time I'm recording this because the first time, halfway through the first question, I just felt like I couldn't talk. I have to get my tongue working and my brain working. But, yeah, anyway. That was just a random thought I had. But hopefully now, I'm feeling the gears are turning now. Hopefully I'll be able to speak decently well. So Katie Woodhams asks, I have 2 questions, both about reading novels. For reference, I guess I would be in stage 2C of the new roadmap. So I'm going to answer the first question. I'm going to read the first question and then answer it, and then read the second question and answer that one. Because that way, each question will be more recent in you guys' minds when I'm answering it. So the first question is, recently most of my input has been through novels. I just read the article about reading novels and that you say that it will delay output. I already knew that my listening to reading ratio is out of whack, but I'd never thought about how the actual domain would affect my ability. Would you be able to talk a bit more about why reading novels could delay output and what novels do and don't bring to the table? Yeah, so basically, the way that the new roadmap is set up is that in stage 2, you're learning to comprehend slice of life media. And at the end of stage 2, you're kind of given this fork in the road where you can either go and learn to comprehend novels, or you can go directly to stage 3 and work on learning how to output. And so at this point, at the end of stage 2, if you take the path of learning how to output, what that consists of is, first of all, learning to comprehend natural, everyday, unscripted speech, because that is a domain that is a little different than the domain of structured, scripted, slice of life media. And of course, you need to understand a domain before you can output in that domain yourself. So the first thing you're doing in stage 3 is learning to comprehend natural unscripted speech, and then you're going on to actually write and then eventually speak in that domain. And so there's that path, and then alternatively there's the path of first going and just learning how to read novels, and then after that you can go and learn how to understand everyday speech and then learn how to speak. So it's not that learning to read novels is somehow harmful to the process of learning how to output in any way. It's just that, different domains are different. And so once you have a basic foundation in comprehension, which you will by the end of stage 2, then learning to comprehend novels won't really add that much to the process of learning how to output. Because when you're outputting, unless you're trying to actually write a novel yourself, what we're talking about in stage 3 output is having natural conversations with people, being able to participate on, Discord servers or just chat with your friends over text, like this type of everyday stuff. And so for that, you just need to get really comfortable and really used to natural everyday speech, which is nothing like novels. And so basically, they're just 2 different paths that are mostly unrelated to one another. Now, if you do take the path of learning how to read novels first, then probably that will give you a little bit more of an advantage when it finally comes time to output. But I wouldn't say it would be that huge because, again, the domains are so different. And really, you have most of the foundation you need to output by the time you finish stage 2. It's really just a matter of getting comfortable in that new domain of everyday speech, and then you pretty much should be good to go. So, what novels bring to the table is the ability to read novels. So if you're into reading novels, then you'll enjoy learning how to read novels. That's really the biggest thing they bring to the table. They also grow your vocabulary a lot, but it's hard to say that this is like a really strong advantage in and of itself, because no matter what you're doing in the language, if there's any word that you need, you'll come across it and you can learn it then. So there are a lot of words that that pretty much only show up in novels, and so the only way to learn them is by reading novels. But said another way, if you don't read novels, then by definition you don't need any of those words because they only show up in novels. And then there are other words that show up pretty frequently in novels, and they do show up outside of novels, but just kind of infrequently. So novels are good for picking up those words, but that being said, again, if you just come across an infrequent word somewhere else in your immersion, you can always just make a card for it and learn it then. So yeah, there's really nothing that novels bring to the table that you can't get elsewhere besides the ability to read novels. So if you're someone who, by the time you finish stage 2, you're just really excited by reading novels and you just really like reading and you like the idea of just really getting comfortable with building up your vocabulary, then you can take that path. But if you're more excited by learning how to speak in the language, then you can take that path and learn how to read novels later. So, so that's the first question. The second question is, before I read the article about reading novels, in an effort to up my listening, I found an audiobook of a book I've already read, and I'm listening to that. I'm enjoying it, and it's meant that I've been able to do more listening. But I feel like I'm kind of cheating. The narrator speaks really slowly and clearly, so the only ambiguity that comes in is when I don't know words or grammatical structures. I think there's a little bit of typo here. But yeah, anyway, the only ambiguity that comes in is when I don't know words or grammatical structures. Also, because I've already read the paper book, it's really predictable, so I guess I'm not getting a lot of practice of the bottom-up listening process. Is this good immersion? Am I cheating? So what I would say is, in general, there's 2 different reasons for getting input in the language, very broadly speaking. From a language learning perspective. The first reason is to grow your comprehension, and the second reason is to try to absorb the details of the language so that you can output at a higher level in a specific domain. Of course, there's also the reason of like just for fun or just for enjoyment or because you need to consume information. But I mean, from a language learning standpoint, there's those 2 reasons to input. And so for that first category of you're getting input because you want to grow your comprehension, then the only question to ask is, am I understanding, or basically how much am I understanding? Because if you're understanding literally 100%, like you have level 6 comprehension in that domain, then your comprehension isn't going to be growing. And so you're not going to be gaining any comprehension growth benefit from listening to that. But if it's less than 100%, but you still are comprehending something, then of course you can, by listening to it, you're going to start slowly working your way up to level 6 comprehension, and that can be beneficial. Then on the other side of you want to learn to grow your output, well, in that sense, it's always going to be beneficial to listen to output that for example, from your language parent, because, realistically, you're probably never going to sound 100% native-like. There's always going to be some little tiny things here or there that natives do that you don't do, or that you do but natives don't. And so even if you have level 6 comprehension in, for example, your language parent, continuing to expose yourself to it will help you slowly pick up those little things that you're missing, and that's going to shape your intuition of the language and help you improve your output later on down the line. So in this case, it sounds like you're probably not really worried about that second category of for the sake of output because you're listening to an audiobook, and unless you're trying to become a novelist in the language that you're studying, then you're probably mostly concerned with A, just general comprehension, and then B, output of everyday speech. And so, yeah, this novel right here is not going to help you with output, but as long as you're not understanding 100% of it, then there is still going to be benefit. It doesn't really matter whether you're cheating or not, because the bottom line is, if there's still content within the audiobook that you're listening to that you don't understand, then those are opportunities to grow. Now, it could be, for example, like, let's just say, I think it's hard to say whether, for the sake of just growing output, it's more efficient to be hanging out in level 4, in content that you have level 4 comprehension in versus level 5 comprehension in. But either way, let's just say that you decide that you want to immerse in content that you have level 4 comprehension in, because that your intuition is that that's what's going to grow your comprehension the most efficiently. So it could be that you take, for example, an audiobook that by default you would have level 3 comprehension of, but then you read the book once first to give you kind of a boost, and now you have level 4 comprehension. So that would mean that it's good practice. And so, like, basically, even if, what I'm trying to say is that even if you're getting a comprehension boost because you're listening to a book that you've read before, that in itself isn't cheating. The bottom line is the level of comprehension that you have right now with the boost the right level of comprehension for you to grow your ability? And it sounds like it could be, because you're saying that you don't, there still is vocab and grammar structures that you're not comprehending. So you're saying, well, the narrator is enunciating perfectly, so I'm not growing my ability to parse blurry speech. Yes, that is true. If that's something that you want to work on right now, then you should probably go and listen to some blurry speech. But if the question is just like, am I getting benefit from this? Well, yeah, you're getting benefit in all the areas that you don't currently understand perfectly. And even if you're getting a boost, then that doesn't matter. The bottom line is just, first of all, are you understanding enough that you're not going to be totally lost? And then second of all, is there still structures and words or something in there that you don't understand, because you can start picking those up? So that is what I would say. Yeah, there's really no concept of cheating unless you're taking a test, and there's no tests in Refold. So Son asks, Matt, what do you think of Japanese people using more and more English words? Do you think that this is a bad thing? That video of Dogen where he makes fun of this is actually kind of depressing, honestly, lol. So yeah, so just for anyone who's not studying Japanese out there, it's really common for Japanese people to import English words into Japanese. For example, the word for bathroom is toire, for toilet in Japanese. But in the last probably 10 years, there's just been this huge influx of English words getting imported into Japanese. And a lot of these words getting imported, there already is a Japanese word for it. So it's not like they're importing the word because there's this new concept and there's no word for it yet in Japanese. The words get imported in because there's this kind of trend where English words are considered to be cool and hip sounding. And so even if there's already a Japanese word for it, people will go out of the way to use the English word to sound either cool or intelligent or smart and things like this. And yeah, it's something that gets talked about a lot, especially among foreigners, because foreigners who study Japanese like Japanese. And so a lot of people don't like that Japanese words are getting replaced with English words. So yeah, my take on this is that, first of all, you got to remember that in a way, this is not a new phenomenon, because Japanese has been borrowing Chinese words for like 1,000 years now. And one thing I noticed when I started studying Chinese was just how much of modern day Japanese is actually Chinese. Like, it feels like close to 50%, because anytime you have a jukugo, which is just like two kanji next to each other and they're read with the onyomi, that's really just a Chinese word that has been borrowed into Japanese. And so after coming from a Chinese perspective, Japanese is already completely filled with Chinese. And so when people say like, oh no, you don't use English words, use traditional Japanese words, and then like their example is something like where instead of using the English word they want you to use a kanji compound, it's like, well, what you're really saying is no, like, don't ruin Japanese by importing English, use Chinese instead. So really, when you look at what percentage of modern day Japanese is actual traditional Japanese words that stem from the language of the people who lived on that island like thousands of years ago, it's a very small amount. Like maybe 30 to 40% total. And so the idea of like, we got to keep Japanese pure, that I think is kind of ignoring that history. The Japanese has never really been pure. That's not really what Japanese is about. Same thing even with Japanese culture, right? Most of the artifacts of Japanese culture that are considered to be like Japanese are really just things that they borrowed from China, like all the traditional music and the traditional dance and the traditional clothing and traditional structure of the government, and all these things were really just stolen from China. And so Japan has always been a culture of stealing other people's ideas and then doing it in their own way and improving upon it and making it unique. And there's actually like a Yoji Jukugo that means that. So basically, yeah, that's my take on the purity thing. But I do think that there are some practical reasons why Japanese is being made a less efficient language by this influx of English words. And this is basically that, in English, a lot of words, you can kind of guess what they mean even though you might be seeing a given word for the first time, because there's these Latin and Greek root and stems, right? Like bicycle to wheel. And so there's kind of this internal cohesion that makes sense. And this is really important, especially like for when you're learning scientific words that are long and have tons of syllables, because it would be really hard to remember these words if you couldn't view them in terms of their component roots and stems and kind of see how the parts make up the whole. That takes a lot of burden off your memory when it comes to learning all these words. And so the same thing happens in Japanese, except it basically happens through kanji, right? Like when you see a kanji for the first time, or a kanji word for the first time, you can generally guess what it's going to mean and how it's read by the component parts of the kanji. But when you just import in an English word, well, Japanese people don't have intimate knowledge of the Latin and Greek roots and stems, and so they're not going to be able to guess what it means. And first of all, a lot of times there's just distinctions lost because there's less total sounds in Japanese, and so a lot of distinctions that exist in English, like L and R, for example, or V and B, get collapsed into the same sound in Japanese. And so first of all, just a lot of ambiguity is created, and so even if someone did have knowledge of the roots and stems of English, they might not be able to identify what they're looking at when that word has been put into katakana, because all these distinctions have been lost and the ambiguity has been raised. But also, yeah, realistically, Japanese people aren't going to get that intimate knowledge of Latin and Greek roots and stems, and so for all those English words, they kind of just have to brute force memorize. And also, my subjective experience is that the English words just don't, they're very bulky and clunky when you put them into Japanese. Like, if you take words like, the only ones that are coming to my mind now are like place names and stuff, but like California, or like McDonald's, it just feels really like clunky and awkward to say compared to like originally Japanese words. And it makes sense because you're taking a word from one sound system and you're brute force shoving it into a totally different sound system. So of course it's going to sound kind of weird and clunky and unnatural. It's not the type of word that would have arose naturally by speakers of that language. And so, there's overall, it just, so first of all, there's the problem with the roots and stems, where now it's going to be harder for Japanese people to remember these words, because instead of being able to just look at it, guess what it means with high accuracy from the roots and stems, they instead have to sound out this oftentimes long, clunky word with no hint as to what it means, and they just have to memorize it. And so this this is difficult for a lot of Japanese people. Like, I know Japanese people who say that when they had a choice between learning Japanese history or world history in high school, they chose Japanese history just because they couldn't remember all the katakana place names and people names. So I know that that's a thing that Japanese people struggle with. So I think it's just making the language less effective as a communication tool by filling it with all these words that are like less accessible to Japanese people. Now, one thing that you might say is that, oh, well, if Japanese people import enough English words, then they'll figure out the roots and stems, and then it won't be a problem anymore. It'll be the same as for native English speakers. But I would say, okay, this might happen to an extent, but like I said, it's never going to happen perfectly, because a lot of the distinctions that exist in English get lost in Japanese because they have fewer sounds. But the other thing is that the more English words that get imported into Japanese and get used regularly, then the less kanji words are going to be used normally. And so the thing with kanji is that it's this huge investment to learn for like a Japanese person, right? Like a Japanese person has to go through like at least 9 years of education to become able to learn kanji at a decent level. And in reality, that's only up to middle school, and they're going to learn more kanji in high school. And so it's this huge upfront investment to learn kanji. And so the more that English enters Japanese, and the smaller the percentage of kanji words grows in terms of like the words that are used on a day-to-day basis, then the worse of an investment it is to spend all those hours learning the kanji, right? Like right now, kanji might make up 40% of Japanese, but if that goes down to like 10%, just hypothetically at some point, right? Then is it still going to be worth spending 9 years learning kanji so that you can read the last 10% of Japanese? It's going to be this problem. And then there's going to be this other problem of now you also have to learn all the Latin and Greek roots and stems. So now the Japanese language is just looking like such a mess, because you have to learn hiragana, katakana, kanji, and you have to memorize all these Latin and Greek roots and stems to have a chance at learning all the English words you need to speak at an adult level. And so, yeah, it's just, I think it gets really messy. Like, especially when you look at Chinese, for example, which is just kanji. And of course, it's not it's a little different than kanji because they're Chinese characters, not the Japanese versions of characters, but they're basically just kanji. And they do sometimes import English words like phonetically, but it's extremely rare compared to Japan. Instead, they translate the meaning. Like in Japan, the word for internet is netto, which is just short for internetto. But in Chinese, it's just the character for a net, like a physical net, and it just has the pronunciation of the word for net, like a fishing net, for example. And for example, cell phone in Japan they call it smaho, which is short for sumato-phone, whereas in China the word is literally just hand machine because it's a little machine you hold in your hand, and it has the character for hand and the character for machine, and it's just pronounced the way that you would guess looking at the characters. So it's just way more efficient for natives to learn words and for new words to get created because all the words in the language are using the same internal system. Just like it'd be like if every word in a language only used like Latin stems. And so, if English was like that, then it would be a lot easier to learn English words, and spelling would be way easier because everything could be consistent, right? English is complicated because it has influences from so many different languages. So yeah, I'd say overall I am not that concerned about the preserving tradition type thing, because I think that's never been a part of Japanese culture, but I do think that Japanese is going to become a less practical language to do things in if this trend continues, and probably will, to be honest. But I also think more and more Japanese people are going to learn English, and the more Japanese people learn English, then the less that Japanese people are going to be spending time and doing things in Japanese, and so it could be a bad trend. But I think a lot of languages in the world are facing this because there's kind of just this pull towards globalization, and so the more of the world that uses English, then the more of a disadvantage you're at by not operating in English. And so I think we might see in the next 50 to 100 years this trend towards the whole world moving towards either English or Chinese. And because there's a lot of other countries in the world right now moving towards Chinese because of the power of China. And so that's kind of sad from a language learner's point of view, but there's so many bigger forces at play. It seems kind of inevitable. But that is just my speculation. Could totally be wrong. I haven't looked into those things that much. So Justin asks, I started the monolingual transition a few weeks ago, and one thing I've noticed with it so far is that when I recall words I learned monolingually, I recall them with a native language word that summarizes the definition. I'm wondering if it would be worth starting output now so that my recall would be in my target language, or if this is something that will naturally work itself out and that I should continue to hold off outputting. So I don't really see how starting output early would force you to recall the words you learn in your target language, because right now, if you're just starting to go monolingual, you still can't really think in your target language yet. Then that probably means you're early stage 2 or maybe mid stage 2. And so if you just forced yourself to start outputting now, what would probably happen is that what would be happening internally when you tried to output is that you would be thinking in English and then translating into your target language. So in a way, you might reinforce that internal translation even more by trying to output. So I don't really see how outputting early could be a solution to what's going on, but I'd say that what you're experiencing now is a supernatural thing that probably happens to everyone, and that I wouldn't worry about it. It will naturally go away with time as you get more comfortable with how monolingual definitions work, and also just more comfortable thinking in your target language in general. But I will say that I think what I realized is that because I had made so many Anki cards with Japanese definitions when I was learning Japanese, and oftentimes in order to test myself to make sure I knew the word, I wouldn't try to memorize the definition word for word. I'd try to kind of almost construct my own monolingual definition in my head, and then I would compare it to what was on the back of the card. And through doing this, I got really comfortable with basically defining Japanese words in terms of other Japanese words in my head. And at one point, I realized that if I wanted to try to define a word, for example, if I was talking to a Japanese person and I accidentally used a word I didn't know, which happens to be more than it should, could actually pretty easily explain what the word means in a very neat and tidy way. And I realized I'm actually worse at this in English because I haven't practiced it nearly as much. I haven't studied how English words get defined in terms of other English words, and I haven't practiced defining them myself. So it's one of the very rare things I'm actually better at in Japanese than in English, is defining what words mean. And so I think that if you do a similar thing where, like, of course, if you're just in the middle of immersing and you come across a word you learn monolingually, it's kind of inevitable that at the beginning, the English equivalent will just pop into your mind. I wouldn't worry about that. And I wouldn't worry about trying to stop and pause your immersion and define words in your head, just because that would be too cumbersome and annoying. But while you're doing your reps, I would recommend trying to maybe construct a definition of the word in your head using your target language. And it's okay if, like, for example, you're reviewing a card, a word comes up, you instantly recall the English equivalent, and then you try to construct a monolingual definition. That will probably happen at the beginning just because you won't be able to stop your brain from spitting out the native language translation. But I would just leave it be. Don't worry about it. It'll naturally fade out over time as you need it less and less. And yeah, I think it can be useful to start the process of trying to recall what a word means in terms of your target language, and you'll just get more comfortable with that over time. So Renfred asks, I really liked the part of this Q&A that talked about motivation and mindset. You've recommended looking at AJAT for motivational posts, but as you've mentioned, Katsumoto's writing is not for everyone, even though I feel like a lot of the value of AJAT comes from the motivational/mindset-oriented content. Have you considered incorporating more of this type of content into Refold? Seems like an important aspect of language learning, maybe as important as the technical process. And you have been good at explaining your wisdom on these topics in these Q&As. Yeah, well, thank you for that compliment, and I'm really glad that my motivation-related /mindset-related answers have been useful to you guys, because I don't really think of myself as somebody who's necessarily good at motivating people. But yeah, I think the way that we're thinking about the Refold roadmap is that we want it to be a very streamlined, almost bare bone instruction manual for the language learning process, with anything that's not strictly necessary kind of stripped out. So we probably won't put any, and also a purpose of that is so that you can come into Refold, read the guide, and then get caught up to speed really quickly, right? Because if we bloat up the guide too big and it becomes this encyclopedia-like thing, then now we have this issue where it's hard to get in. But we will have other sections of the site with other content besides just the actual roadmap, and we'll probably at some point create motivational content and put it over there. So we just want to be very clear of like what do you need when you get in, and what other stuff is kind of optional or maybe helpful later down the line, but it's not like crucial. It's kind of optional in a way. And I had put the motivational content in that section, even though of course it can be really helpful. But I also think that the motivational stuff is less one size fits all. Like, I think there's different approaches to the motivation, there's kind of the more hard ass approach, there's the more like make it really easy for yourself approach, and I think different styles are going to resonate with different people. So that's probably another reason to not have it as part of the official guide, but have it in a separate section of the site. But we have a lot of ideas for articles and things that we want on the site, just probably not part of the actual roadmap. So it's at some point we'll have more of that. So Anton de la Fuente asks, do you have general advice for learning keigo? Do you have any recommendations for immersion content with a lot of keigo? For my recommendation for learning keigo is basically first just get achieve basic fluency in Japanese, and then buy books meant for native speakers on how to learn keigo and SRS the books. So native speakers who enter the job force need to consciously study keigo. Like, they need to buy books about it and learn about it. By the way, for anyone who doesn't know, keigo is the polite form of Japanese. And so if native speakers can't just pick it up through immersion, then I wouldn't count on you being able to pick it up through immersion either. There's a lot of kind of arbitrary, very technical rules and things like that probably couldn't, like, the only reason they can exist is because Japanese people consciously study and reinforce those rules, meaning they're not something that comes naturally to the language acquisition device, at least not at the level that they need to for you to be able to speak keigo properly. So yeah, I would say go and buy some books meant for Japanese people who are about to enter the job force, and just memorize everything in them and then practice them a lot. Practice speaking keigo. I don't have any recommendations for immersion content with keigo off the top of my head, and I'm not even sure whether all types of immersion content use proper keigo, because there's some debate over what is proper keigo and what is not. But when it comes to keigo, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot you can find. Anything that involves like workplaces or business trades, like business deals and things like that. If anyone knows any good ones, you can put it in the description. But I would say, yeah, the biggest thing is you pretty much just gotta study it, because even Japanese people have to study it. So Benjamin Eastwood asks, "Hey Matt, I'm wondering if you have any advice on picking a domain, or if you could give some more examples of common domains and how to immerse in them with multiple media types. I'm currently watching a fantasy TV show and reading a historical fiction novel, and I'm not exactly sure how to narrow my domain while still benefiting from multiple media types." Yeah, so I think we talk a lot about this in the site. I think if you read through stage 2 of the Refold roadmap, then you're probably going to get a lot more clarity on this. I'm not sure exactly what you mean by multiple media types. Do you mean like a TV show and a book? Or do you mean like different genres? I mean, you say a fantasy TV show and a historical novel, so I'm guessing you mean like actual different mediums. Well, and it also depends on where you are in the language learning process, because if you're in stage 2, then we pretty much on the site explicitly recommend, if you can help it, finding slice of life content, because that's going to be the easiest to learn from, and it's going to put you in a good place to learn everyday speech in stage 3 and get you outputting. So if you haven't already mastered at least one domain, then I would say just choose slice of life. If you're pretty much past stage 3 and you're in stage 4 and you're just trying to spread out, then I'd say it matters less how strategic you are, because by the time that you finish stage 3, you have such a strong foundation in the language that picking up new domains is not going to be very difficult. Like, you could just jump into a TV show in a new domain, make some cards as you go, and you can kind of figure it out. So I would say if you make your the different media that you're consuming at any given point in time match, that's probably going to help you improve more efficiently. So for example, you can watch a fantasy TV show while you read a fantasy novel, or you can watch a historical drama as you read a historical fiction novel or a nonfiction fiction novel, and things like that. That way the different things you're doing will reinforce each other, and you'll probably be able to improve more efficiently. But I wouldn't say it's absolutely crucial, because like I said, by the time that you get to stage 4, you have such a strong foundation that picking new things up isn't too difficult. Basim W asks, "I'm not sure if this has ever been discussed, but what's your opinion on speeding up a video/podcast you're immersing with? For example, if there's a 40-minute episode and I watch it on 1.3 speed, I could finish it in 30.77 minutes. I would still be inputting all the content, but I would be saving almost 10 minutes. Of course, a speed that's too high wouldn't really work because it's not emulating how real speakers speak." So I think that it's hard to speak with any level of confidence on this particular topic, because it's just the type of thing where we need some actual data. Like, we need some people to run studies on acquisition speed compared to speed of content. But what my intuition says is that, first of all, if let's say you have this 40-minute podcast, right? We acquire language through comprehending input. And so if when you listen to that podcast on 1x speed, you would only understand, you would only have, for example, level 4 comprehension of it, then I would say you don't want to speed it up, because that's going to drop your comprehension even more, and then you're going to acquire less. If you're listening to something, you have level 4, level 5 comprehension, then that's probably the kind of sweet spot for acquiring more language. And so when you're talking about messing with the speed, you're basically messing with the difficulty. And so you want the difficulty to match what's going to help you acquire the most quickly. And so basically, if there's something that you have 100% comprehension of, then it would make sense to start speeding it up, because then you're kind of artificially adding even more difficulty, which will, first of all, allow you to get more exposure to the language total per hour, but even more than anything, then it will probably force your brain to learn to process the language more quickly. because you're challenging it, right? So I'd say it's less a matter of like how many words do you expose yourself per hour, and it's more a matter of like, are you challenging yourself at the right level? Because being properly challenged is what's going to grow you the most. So that's probably how I would think about it. The other thing is that for pronunciation in particular, that is what's going to get really warped when you start speeding it up. And like for example, one of the problems that people have at a very high level is that even though they can speak a language very fluently and they have good pronunciation, they actually pronounce too many sounds. They don't drop sounds in the same way that native speakers do, right? So they might, instead of saying like don't you want to go, they might say like, don't you want to go? And that still sounds fine, but it sounds a little bit unnative like. And so picking up the particular ways that natives slur their speech together and drop and convert different sounds is one of the trickiest issues to perfecting a foreign accent, or perfecting an accent in a foreign language. And I'd say if you start speeding it up, those little things get lost really quickly. Like even at point 1.3 speed, probably fine, but even so, like if I was listening to a language with the intent of trying to acquire the particularities of the pronunciation as much as possible, then I would probably just listen to it at 1x speed, because that's the actual speed that it was getting spoken at, right? So zero distortion. And so there's that. So I'd say for pronunciation in particular, you probably don't want to be speeding it up. But besides that, if you're just talking about, general processing speed of the language, or in general just vocabulary and grammar, then yeah, it makes sense to speed it up as long as you have full comprehension of it before you speed it up. Otherwise, you're just probably going to make it more difficult than is ideal. So yeah, for pronunciation, probably don't speed it up. For everything else, then just pay attention to how much you're comprehending and adjust it so that you have what you feel is a level of comprehension that's going to make you improve most optimally. After you've like totally mastered a domain and you have level 6 comprehension, then I do think it makes sense to speed it up to try to force your processing speed to get better and better. So John L asks, you often say watching videos with subtitles is a hybrid activity more akin to reading. For someone who's trying to transition to pure listening practice, how do you recommend they approach their study? For instance, should they just listen, and if they don't understand, move on? Or listen various times and then read the subtitles and then listen again? What's most effective? I think, again, this is something it's hard to say for sure. I mean, obviously, there's lots of times where if you're watching without subs and you miss something, if you go back a couple seconds and turn on the subs and basically look at what the answer was, then you get the subjective experience of suddenly being able to hear what you couldn't hear before. But that's just because you already know the answer, and so you're like, that's not proof that you've now grown your fundamental baseline ability, and if you would have, and next time you come across something like that, you're going to understand it the first time. It could be that you're only feeling like you understand it because you know the answer, but you haven't fundamentally improved. So I think it's hard to say whether like looking at the answer after you missed something really helps or not, but I mean, at the very least, I don't think it can hurt. I mean, I think that if you're pausing and looking at the answer too often, then you might be actually teaching your brain that it doesn't need to learn how to understand, because it can always just get the answer for free. So I think no matter what you do, you don't want to be pausing and looking at the answer too frequently. You want to sometimes just let yourself miss some things, because I think that actually signals to your brain that being able to comprehend spoken language without any crutches is an important tool, and you're going to be missing out on important things if you don't have that tool. But of course, for every once in a while, it's totally fine to just look at the answer, especially if you're actually enjoying a piece of media and you don't want to just miss out on what someone said, because it could have been an important piece of plot information or something like that. Then it's totally fine to look at the answer. And maybe that will help your brain in some way, but my intuition is that your listening ability gets better by your brain solving these puzzles itself, and giving it the answer isn't going to help it fundamentally improve its baseline ability. So I would say, in general, just listen. Try to find something that you have like at least level 4 comprehension of. Just listen to it. Every once in a while, you can pause and look at the subtitles, but I wouldn't like listen to it over and over and over. I would mostly just try to watch it through naturally. I guess for like for when you miss something, I guess you can listen to it like an additional 1 or 2 times before looking at the subs to try to hear it as well. But again, just you don't want to get into the habit of constantly pausing and rewinding, because that's not going to signal the right thing to your mind. And then someone actually commented a question to this saying, just another question related to this. In the roadmap, pure listening is optional. So would we learn to listen without any subtitles or visual aid? Is the listening when reading TV shows or watching TV shows without subtitles enough? So yeah, technically, pure listening is when you're listening to something without any visual stimuli at all. So for example, listening to a podcast with no video component, and realistically a podcast with a video is pretty much still pure listening, because the visuals aren't hinting at what's being said at all. They're just 2 people sitting and talking. But if you're watching a TV show with no subtitles, that's the visual component is going to be really aiding your comprehension. So that's why we say it's not pure listening. And so yeah, pure listening is optional, because realistically, as long as you watch content without subtitles, that is still really good listening practice. Yeah, you get a little bit of a comprehension boost from the visuals, but it's not nearly as much as you get from the subtitles. So the important thing is you have to learn how to watch without subtitles. It's less important to learn how to watch with, or how to understand with, 0 visual aids at all. So let's see, how are we doing on time? Not bad. Man, my throat is really dry. So Remy Flounders asks, in my current situation where I work, I could get up to 7 hours of active immersion listening, working at a warehouse, pretty much doing my own mindless thing. But I'm not really sure how to most optimally use this time. I can't look words up since I'm working, and for reference, I'm pretty close to the beginner level. I've only been doing this for a couple months. Basically, should I just keep mindlessly throwing myself at any Japanese audio I can find, without being able to look up words? How much am I realistically getting out of it? In my particular situation, do you think something like Pimsleur could possibly be helpful? So what I would say is that, well, first of all, you didn't mention how much immersion time you have outside of work, where you can look things up and do intensive immersion. Because if you do, like, for example, let's say you have like 3 hours a day on each weekend day to actively immerse and at home and do intensive active immersion, and maybe you have an additional 1 hour per day after work when you get home. If you could use those times to intensively immerse with content, and intensive immersion is where you're pausing after each line of a show you're watching, you're looking up most of the words in the subtitles, trying to understand what's going on. If you have, like, let's say, ideally like 10 hours a week that you can spend on that, then you can use those, well, it's not going to be 10 hours because of course you're pausing and stopping, but let's say you get like 5 hours worth of content per week. Through 10 hours of intensive active immersion, you get 5 hours of content that you've gone through with almost a fine-tooth comb, you could say. And then if you listen to those on repeat for 7 hours every day, you're going to be getting a lot out of that. Because once you have intensively immersed with something, then you know all the words that are in there, you know roughly what's being said, and so when you actually listen to it, for passive listening, or in your case, it'll be closer to active because you'll be paying a lot of attention, but still, you'll be able to tell what scene is happening, and you'll remember some of the words that were said, and that will make it a lot closer to actually watching something with a visual aid, plus you'll just be able to reinforce all the stuff that you looked up. So that would make it very beneficial, I would say. So what I'd say is try to get as much time outside of work for intensive active immersion, and go through shows that during that time, and then take that audio and passively listen to it, or listen to it during work. That'll make it very beneficial. Pimsleur, no, that's not going to help you at all. Pimsleur is basically just teaching you random phrases out of context that are trying to force you to have like a very particular scripted conversation, and that's not really going to be moving you on a path that leads towards fluency, in my opinion. Okay, so last question. Berber asks, I've been preparing for the output stage starting in April of this year by doing the daily shadowing and pitch accent stuff. Just recently started doing short output videos a few days ago. However, since I'm in the beginning of this stage and don't have any reason to rush, I've been having second thoughts after reading the site and some discussions in the Discord server. From what I understand, the roadmap is, first of all, getting very comfortable with a single domain, like Slice of Life, and then move on to the output stage, and then go into other domains after that. I'm wondering if this is because it is particularly ideal, or if it would be better, assuming you aren't in a hurry for whatever reason, to wait until you have expanded into other domains with, say, a level 5 comprehension and level 6 in your first domain before starting output. So the way that I think about it, and this kind of relates to the novel question earlier in this Q&A, domains are separate from one another. And so when you're talking about learning how to output, the important thing is that you have level 6 comprehension in the domain that you're trying to output in. So if you have a level 6 comprehension, which is, again, very high, it's like, that means when you're listening to that domain, it feels almost the same as your native language. If you have level 6 comprehension in an everyday speech, then you're ready to go when it comes to learning how to output an everyday speech. And whether or not you can understand fantasy novels or not is pretty much unrelated. And so, in a way, as long as you have level 6 comprehension in the domain that you're going to start outputting in, then there's no true advantage to waiting and immersing in other domains instead, I would say. Maybe there's some slight advantage because, if the conversation starts to go in a direct, like basically when you do start outputting, because you will have exposed yourself to a wider range of domains, there'll be a wider range of places that a conversation can go without you feeling like out of your element. But ultimately, I'd say that it doesn't matter that much. And the other thing is that once you actually start outputting, that allows you to start taking more away from your input potentially, because you become aware of your blind spots, and then you pay more attention to those blind spots when you're immersing, and then you absorb more. So that's also another reason why we put output relatively early on the roadmap, is because I think there actually are benefits that do come from output, in the sense of it helps you take more away from your immersion. But again, that's a rather small thing, and that's a rather small benefit, the outputting earlier, and it's also a small benefit to have more domains under your belt by the time you start outputting. So really, it doesn't matter that much, and it really comes down to your priorities. So I'd say, if you're in a place where output isn't that interesting or relevant to you, but there are a lot of other domains you want to learn to understand, then it's totally fine to push the output into the future and focus on that. And of course, it's fine to do the default of the roadmap, because that's why we put it that way. So yeah, I'd say it really just comes down to what your personal interests are, and there's no strong pros or cons either way. So yeah, that's all the questions for this week. There's less people on the Patreon right now, so if you want to ask a question, it's a lot more likely that it'll get answered. I even today answered multiple questions that only had one upvote. So yeah, it's really likely that your question will get answered if you post it. So go ahead and post any questions that you have. Again, thanks so much for supporting, and I will see you guys in the next one.